Welcome back. I'm Annisa Omar. The story of Syrian migrants travelling to Europe has populated the recent headlines for many months now. The decades-old plight of Sub-Saharan African migrants who make the same journey has received far less attention. Arguably, the reason could be simply a case of numbers, with Syrian refugees in the hundreds of thousands. However, some migrants and aid officials argue the issue could be one of nationality and thus race, which has unwittingly divided the migrants into two distinct classes, with two different kinds of supporting EU policy and welcome. We have this exclusive report. There is a growing concern that Europe may unwittingly be dividing migrants into two distinct groups of Africans and non-Africans. However, many argue that policy processes are far too slow-paced and long overdue. The hundreds of thousands of Syrian migrants fleeing has greatly received the world's attention, and less so the plight of the many number of Sub-Saharan African migrants who have been making the same journey for many decades now. Some 80,000 of Sub-Saharan African migrants have reached Libya this year alone. Several African asylum seekers in Sicily described overwhelming bureaucratic hurdles towards their goals. A far different picture than the tens of thousands of Syrians whom the EU and US now appear to be hosting willingly.
Good reception means also good identification, and this is the very first step to allow all the European states to host the refugees. It's very clear now to everybody that what Europe needs is a common project. Nobody can be out of this project, otherwise the crisis will not be managed. And this is a manageable crisis. It's about 600,000 people.
Yet both sets of newcomers share one experience: life-threatening journeys to Europe. Upon unseaworthy boats, Sub-Saharan Africans can be found at the bottom of the social hierarchy, as they receive the more precarious positions, such as near the boat engine, in comparison to their non-African counterparts. Young people arriving in the Italian port of Lampedusa told workers from Save the Children how migrants from Sub-Saharan African countries were often kept below the deck, deprived of water and sunlight. The question therefore arises, for those observing this phenomenon, is why would someone take this journey? Conflict, poverty and lack of opportunity have characterized Africa and are often reasons migrants make this journey. However, the story is far more multifaceted than that. Not all those who migrate have a poor background. Some migrants are young men and women from urban areas who are financially supported or at least encouraged by their families to undertake this journey. Europe is deeply rooted in a young Sub-Saharan African representation of success, either through the media or stories of families or friends finding success in Europe. Migration also opens up Africans' global interconnectedness, both personally for the migrant or for the families who gain remittances. It is these stories that migrants often look to for optimism and hope. As one former Somali migrant named Safia told me, Somalis will always migrate if our country does not change, and we need help to do that safely and humanely. Annisa Omar, Africa This Week. And welcome back. I'm Annisa Omar. The story of Syrian migrants. So Bilal, welcome to us here in the studio. Hi. Hi. Syrian refugee crisis has gained a lot of world attention. What are your thoughts on the crisis?
Well, I think that one of the things that's happening right now is that the crisis is being taken as an existential threat to the European order, political order as we know it, rather than simply a question of the number of refugees that are coming. If it was simply a question about the number of refugees, it wouldn't be called a refugee crisis. I think that what you're seeing is that the refugees are really illuminating a bunch of structural problems in how the European Union is functioning, about how individual countries are functioning within the European framework, and core limitations on the liberal democratic frameworks that these countries are adopting, particularly since the end of the Cold War.
And consequences of state collapses due to many wars?
Of course, yeah. And like now, and you're seeing something here, which is the fact that the Syrian state collapse and the Iraqi state collapse that is the result of these many wars is now finally starting to affect Europe in a very clear and very structurally manifest way. And that's part of the reason why there's been such an effort to downplay the potential changes that can be made.
And do you think that the focus has been a lot on the Syrian refugee crisis and less so on other refugees and migrants that have come from Sub-Saharan Africa and that have been taking this journey for many decades?
I certainly do believe so, and I think we cannot overlook the question of racism and racial dynamics within this happening. The fact is that you have refugees coming in from Syria that are not treated in the same way as refugees that are coming in from Sub-Saharan Africa, because as that report showed, you have a situation here where there's been a permanent crisis in many areas of Sub-Saharan Africa, including armed conflict for many decades, generating consistent waves of refugees. It never led to something like this. It took Syria and Iraq collapsing to do this. And we have to question why.
Why? So we're going to bring Paolo Novak, who is a development studies lecturer at SOAS, School of Oriental and African Studies. So Paolo, you're very much, obviously know a lot about development studies. What is the difference? What is happening within the migrant crisis in recent times?
Sorry, I'm not hearing you very well. If you're asking me about the causes of this way, well...
What is the refugee crisis? So it's been the most refugees since World War II has been reported. What has brought our world to these terms?
Well, the term refugee crisis has been kind of popularized by a recent UNHCR report. And the report effectively was saying that since the end of World War II, effectively the number of persons of concern to UNHCR has been at its highest. And I think it's hovering around 14.5 million. This is kind of an interesting figure, but perhaps not as interesting as the figure that talks about the increase in number in people of concern. I mean, that 15 million figure covers people who've been considered refugees for over 3 decades, such as Afghans in Pakistan, for instance. What is new, effectively, what has happened over the last 2 years is that 2 more million refugees and, in fact, 11 more million IDPs have been generated by conflict and...
now, we're saying these terms of IDPs, refugees and migrants. We're very much aware of what those terms mean. But for our audiences at home, could you perhaps differentiate these terms for us?
Absolutely. I mean, these are very much contested terms. I mean, much like the distinction between refugee and economic migrant. And that's something that is especially relevant for the case of Sub-Saharan Africans. But according to international law, refugee is somebody who faces persecution at home and manages to seek asylum in a country other than the one where he or she belongs. An IDP, or internally displaced person, is a person which faces the same kind of condition but actually never crosses an international border.
And do you feel that the narrative of Sub-Saharan African migrants or subsequent refugees is not given as much media spotlight and research within the academia arena?
Well, there has been a lot of research on a regional basis. I mean, certainly refugees, either Sudanese refugees and their plight on a regional basis, or in other situations, there has been quite a lot of studies. Certainly, there's never been too much emphasis on their movement to Europe, primarily because states have been considering the overwhelming majority of those making it to Europe as economic migrants, i.e., according to them, as people not facing political persecution and forced to leave, but people making a voluntary choice to seek a better future elsewhere.
So in terms of research, Bilal, to bring you back into the conversation, do you think there is enough research going, as Paolo's saying, but is that being used and utilised to really help Sub-Saharan African refugees within the camps, for instance, in Libya and now in areas such as Jordan?
Well, I think we're entering a very helpful phase of governance when it comes to this. Many states are at least willing to publicly admit that there's a problem in how they deal with the refugees. And I think a lot of that research is going to be very useful to various actors as they try to find a solution. I think it will be most useful to non-state groups and to activists working on the ground in order to figure out how individual communities and how there can be a grassroots democratic response to this. Because I honestly don't see the existing frameworks as being able to deal with this current wave of refugee problems. And I certainly don't think that the UNHCR, which is consistently on the verge of bankruptcy and was barely able to keep its own operations afloat in the last few years, is going to be able to handle something this massive. And we haven't even talked about the fact that climate change is going to generate even more waves of refugees over the next century.
So Paolo, what are your thoughts in terms of UNHCR and the international community? Do you think they're doing enough to help build a clear understanding that refugees and migrants are all the same regardless of nationality, or do you think there has been a bias in terms of who has come first?
You asking me?
Yes.
Yes. Well, look, I think opinions are divided as usual. I think there is some people who says UNHCR has done too little in the sense that has not been able to uphold any of the protection standards that it is supposed to uphold, and in fact has been kind of cawing on the back of its major donors in EU, and in a sense brushing away some of the most visible human rights abuses that have been happening perhaps elsewhere for a long time, but certainly that are relatively new in a European context. Other people saying it's doing too much in the sense that it's providing effectively a legitimacy cover for some of the most violent expressions of border controls and the militarization of borders. So, and probably the truth is it's in both camps to a certain extent. As the other speaker was highlighting, certainly UNHCR is caught up in an intricate web of international political conditions, funding crisis, and very local situations that certainly make it an important political actor as opposed to exclusively humanitarian actor.
So what is it that we can do as a public to really put pressure on such agencies to effectively create change? Because we've seen that there's been much uproar in terms of protests, not only across Europe, but other developing nations.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure if UNHCR is perhaps the best target that we should find. I mean, there has been a lot of pressure in many member states in the EU to change the laws, to provide more funding. We should definitely intervene in the debate about relocation, resettlement. But I think we also have a responsibility towards migrants and refugees to express solidarity. I think one important thing we could all do is to broaden the debate and to actually think about the actual causes of this, and to interpolate our own states, not only in relation to protection and the reception of migrants, but in relation to their complicity in causing a lot of these migration waves, both through development policies that have been failing for over 4 decades, and more directly through their involvement in conflict and wars in the Middle East and elsewhere.
So Bilal, bringing back to the issue of nationality and race, do you think this really plays a part in the unreported and unresearched areas of the Sub-Saharan African narrative?
Yes, I think we have to be honest about that, and I don't think we can avoid it at all. The fact of the matter is that even as we've been talking about refugees, even before the Syrian civil war and even before the conflict in Iraq, a great deal of the discussion on refugees and migrants has focused on the case study of Palestine, for often very good reason. However, the fact of the matter is that you can't ignore that there has been a racial dynamic there in how we talk about refugee and migrant issues emanating from the Middle East in comparison to issues in Sub-Saharan Africa that barely manage to get discussed in a mainstream way. And
so
this is true.
There should be many lessons learned.
Yes.
And learned not only in terms of looking at it from a nationalistic angle, but in terms of a practical angle. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, in terms of a practical angle, the fact of the matter is that if we don't talk about a huge section of the people that are in this situation, then we can't handle it structurally. And if we don't handle it structurally, then we have a situation where another group can easily fall into it if things go wrong. And that's exactly what has happened. We didn't talk about the problem involving people from Sub-Saharan Africa in this issue of refugees and in this issue of migrant rights, and then we were never able to solve the issue. And now you have Syrian and Iraqi and all sorts of other people soon. I think there will be one involving Yemenis. And
we're going to have to end the conversation there, Bilal. Unfortunately, I would like to go on, and it's a great discussion. I want to thank you, and I want to thank Paolo. And our time is up on this episode of Africa This Week. I want to thank you all, my guests, for joining us, and to you at home for watching. We'll be back next week at the same time. And in case you missed the show, a repeat will be aired tomorrow at 4 p.m. We will leave you with scenes of the Ethiopian city of Harare, known for the tradition of feeding hyenas every night. It dates back to a famine in the 19th century when food was offered to hyenas to deter them from eating their livestock. Now, thanks to an increase in tourists, the Ethiopian government plans to start paying a monthly salary to the hyena men to keep the ritual alive. Until next week, have a good evening.